Let's turn to something a little bit different now and focus on France and its efforts to redefine itself and its foreign policy with French-speaking nations. To illustrate this point, President Emmanuel Macron has spoken for the first time over the phone with Madagascar's new military-backed leader, Colonel Michael Randrianarina, pledging France's support during the island nation's political transition. Amidst Gen Z-led protests and economic unrest, Macron urged youth and civil society inclusion, backing reforms, anti-corruption measures, and timely elections in the former French colony. Let's take a look.
They have not met yet, but French President Emmanuel Macron is already seeking to position himself vis-à-vis the new authorities in Madagascar. According to the Élysée Palace, during his telephone conversation with his Malagasy counterpart on Saturday, he welcomed the announcement of a national consultation process, a series of reforms, and the organizations of elections within a reasonable timeframe. The French head of state then offered his country's support.
France wishes to accompany and support the transition underway in accordance with the aspirations expressed by the Malagasy people, particularly young people. The French president also announced the payment of budgetary aid earmarked in particular for food security in the country.
The French president had already made a promise of support a week earlier during his visit to Mauritius. The coup has reignited resentment against France, Madagascar's former colonial occupier. The exfiltration of former President Ange Rajouel by Paris has outraged many citizens of the island. On the ground, members of the Malagasy civil society have criticized the direction taken by the transition. According to them, there are worrying signs of continuity with the bad practices of the past.
Well, tonight I'm joined on set by Eléonore Caroit, France's Minister for Global Partnerships and Francophonie countries, to go over all of this. And Eléonore, I believe you were with Emmanuel Macron on his recent visits across Africa as well as Latin America. A really crucial moment for France. And now we hear of Macron reaching out to the new Malagasy regime. In terms of France's position on Madagascar, do they recognize this new administration? And how is Macron aiming to at least appease to these Generation Z protesters and say that France is on your side?
Well, France is indeed talking to this generations and to civil societies in Madagascar. We have a very large French community, and I am also the minister in charge of French people living abroad. So it was of the utmost importance to ensure that they were safe and secured and that they were also accompanied during the process. And when the refoundation government took place, was installed, our ambassador went and met with this new power in place. And I actually met with a new Minister for Development in Rwanda during the Ministerial Summit for the Francophonie. And yesterday, President Macron spoke, as you said, with the new president of the Refoundation, and he's actually showed and expressed the support of France in achieving a transition so that new elections can take place rapidly, so that youth and civil societies are involved in this transition and in this process, which is very important for France. And we're also contributing to the security and the development of Madagascar. We are already present with several projects, but we're also willing to give more funding, in particular for food insecurity in the south of the country, and also for medical assistance in the capital. And this is also something that was discussed.
Coming away from those talks, are you under the impression that those words will be taken into account and that we can expect elections soon?
Well, I do certainly hope so. And from the various discussions at different levels that we've had, there seems to be an intention for this process to be normalized and elections to take place rapidly. And in any event, you were mentioning before, this willingness of France to be able to speak to people, to civil society, and also to see that their legitimate concerns are addressed. And this is it's true in Madagascar, but it's also true in other parts of the world. And I think it really is what drives us in the discussions that we have in a context that can sometimes be a bit unpredictable.
But France is often blamed as a former colonial power for being responsible for what's led to the problems in a lot of these Francophonie countries, namely, I'm looking at Guinea-Bissau recently with the coup. How does France get these countries back on side, especially in such political turmoil?
Well, again, as you see, there's been several coups in different countries and several uncertainties and the situations, again, are of concern for my ministry, first and foremost in terms of security for the French people that live in those countries. So the first thing we do is we ensure that they're safe, that they are also, that the situation is under control, or that we can safely evacuate them when this is needed, which is not the case in Guinea, because from what I understand, the situation has now returned to a calm. But the idea is really to be able to talk to the leaders, to talk to the youth, to ensure that that the legitimate claims are heard and are taken into account. We don't do any sort of entrance into politics, and we do see that there's been a lot of instability. But what we do want to keep is a real solid bound, in particular with the youth.
In terms of Guinea-Bissau, again, the same question. Do you recognize this new government?
Well, it's really recent for Guinea-Bissau. Madagascar, we've had several weeks to see how the situation was evolving, and also the guarantees that the Refoundation government was given. For Guinea-Bissau, we've seen, as you, what happened on Friday, I guess it was, and ensure that French people are safe, and the French school was able to have their kids go back to their houses. The French also cultural center, and for the time being, we're waiting to see how the situation unfolds to be able to have a clearer and position.
What is the point where it unfolds to that you can actually give a defined position?
I guess it really depends on the country, and it depends on the situation. And when situations are evolving all the time, it is very difficult to say or to give you some sort of formula. But what we do see is that we don't do any sort of ingerence, but we do ensure that institutions, democratic processes are taking care. And as we said, these are, for some of them, it's not necessarily the case for the last one we mentioned, but for some of those countries, those are countries that are part of instances of discussion, multilateral instances, and we also ensure that new governments participate and also abide by the values that are also the drivers of those instances.
But there has to be a red line drawn in terms of democracy. How does France ensure that that process carries on without interfering and overriding a country's sovereignty?
As you said, it is a very difficult fine line to define, and this is why we don't do any sort of ingerence, but we do ensure that guarantees are given, and we also try as much as possible to keep the dialogue and to see how these legitimate claims and expectations are factored in. So again, I don't have one formula to give you that would apply to any change of regime that has taken place over the past months or years. In particularly in Africa, we've seen different of these difficult and unstable situations. But I guess what is important, and in particular from the Francophonie perspective and from the OIF, the Organization of the Francophonie, is to see that the changes in governments and in regimes do end up with governments that do abide by the values that we all stand for, and this includes, of course, democracy and gender equality, and I can give you a few others.
Would you put Gabon's new government under Brice Oligui Nguema under that, or how do you actually respond to claims from the new authorities saying France must stay in its place?
Well, actually, President Macron was in Gabon recently, and the visit was very productive and fruitful. And our cooperation, in particular, our economic cooperation with the Trans-Gabonais, which is the trains that goes from one side to the other in the country, and that goes to the manganese mines that are actually being exploited by French companies, is an example of how we can continue to work, how we can actually improve our relationships, how transitions actually lead to more stable relationships. And it was actually a very productive and positive discussions that our leaders had at that time in Gabon. So as I said, it is very difficult to give you one example that would apply to all. There's no one fit all solution, but there is a clear interest in continuing to discuss and to maintain this conversation. And this is also what we're going to do at the Africa Forward Forum
in Nairobi in Kenya next year.
Exactly. And the idea is, of course, for the Leaders Summit to have all the leaders that, of course, come from democratic countries and are also share the same values and are willing to have a broad discussion. But even for those countries where you've had changes in regime, the idea is to be able to include civil society, businesses, academia, scientists, so that we have a broader discussion with all of the African continent and to show that our relationship with Africa looks forward, no, not backwards.
I'd love to talk more about France's position with using Anglophone countries like Kenya to further its aims and agendas, and also looking at the vacuum created by its leadership and what that means for the West versus the influence of China, Russia, and others. But unfortunately, we have to draw a line under that. Thank you so much, as always, Eléonore Caroit,
Thank you.
joining us here on France 24, discussing France on the global stage.